I want to talk to you about one of the most iconic sounds, not in only jungle and drum and bass, but in electronic music as a whole. Today, we're going to dive into respaces. But first, a brief history lesson. In the late 80s, Kevin Saunderson's early side project moniker Reese featured a tune called Just One Another Chance. The first instance of this sound being featured. I'm sure people can dispute this stuff, and this isn't really a history lecture. So the late 80s, Reese writes the tune Just One Another Chance, features this sound that no one's heard before, and then later gets resampled by Renegade and featured in a tune called Terrorist. This tune features the detuned Reese bass line with breakbeat choppage, and this eventually becomes symbolic of the subgenre or genre of music jungle, which then becomes drum and bass. The real takeaway here is that the sound came initially from techno and then was repurposed into something that we would call jungle. And fast forward all this time, here we are today. Now let's dive into what a respace is. There are countless approaches to designing these, but initially, I think it's good to start on what is the characteristic that makes a respace, and that is phase cancellation. That might be a term that you've heard as a no-no term, or a bad word, or rules that shouldn't be broken. I would argue that phase cancellation is simply an event that occurs in sound, and it can either have good or bad effects on the sounds that you're working with. An example of bad phase cancellation usually is when people are referring to a kick and a bass not being in phase, and the phase cancellation is destroying the integrity of the low end in something. So maybe your sub is getting lost in your track because your kick is interfering with your bass, or something is interfering with your bass. And then there's instances of good or interesting phase cancellation. A respace, I think, is the best argument for why phase cancellation can be good. For those who aren't aware of what phase cancellation is, when you take two waveforms and you change them slightly, let's say we have two sine waves. If you change them slightly, they start to create imperfections in the unified waveform at the end. And if they are flipped 90 degrees, they're polar opposites of each other. Actually, this would demonstrate. I will cut this here and then jump into the DAW. So what is a respace? Well, a respace essentially comes down to phase cancellation. It's the documentation of an event occurring, and that event is phase cancellation. There are many ways to approach getting this. There are ways that are controllable, there's ways that are uncontrollable, clean, dirty. They all have their own character and they all fit into their own context. So I would say there isn't really a good or bad way to make a respace. There's a lot of ways. We're going to go over that. So let's look at it. So to demonstrate what phase cancellation is, I want to look at an oscilloscope, and specifically I want to use two sine waves to show you what's happening, because we might not always be able to hear it. So just turn over this patch real quick. This is literally two sine waves, and I'm just going to drag this out to another window so that you can see what I'm doing in real time. Now, if I play any note, you'll just see a sine wave. What happens with phase cancellation and respaces is if we take one of the oscillators and slightly detune it, we've now created a subtle difference in between waveforms. And you'll see I have one hard panned left and one sine wave hard panned right. So left will be orange and right will be blue. They're in unison right now, so you don't see multiple sine waves. But if I detune one slightly, you can now see they're occurring at different frequencies, and therefore are not in sync and they're not in unison. The more we begin to detune, the more obvious the phase cancellation will sound. So if we really turn the detune up, it's kind of the beginnings of a respace. So let's actually dive into some patches and look at some ways to create these. Because again, there are countless ways to do this. Some can be time consuming, some not so much. But I would like to show you some ways that you can either make a respace if you have no idea how to, or if you already know how to, potentially level up how you make your respace and maybe get some extra character out of a sound. So the first instance of a Reese bass that we can look at is kind of the traditional approach. A lot of tutorials out there will say open up your synth or grab a waveform. In this case, it's a saw wave. It could be a sine wave or maybe a square wave. There isn't really a rule. Typically, the classic Reese bass is known as saw waves, and they're going to tell you to add unison and then start to detune and get notes like this. And that's not really something that I would consider suitable for 2025 or potentially 2026, whenever this video comes out. It's not very modern at this point. I think this is kind of a lazy approach now. Something that I like to do that is very similar, but at the same time also I think allows you more control, is to take two oscillators with no unison. So essentially we're manually creating the voices and slightly detuning, usually with fine tune on the oscillators. You could also do it with a coarse pitch. I don't think I would do it with a semitone detune because it's going to be too abrupt. Unless you're just creating like a one shot or something and you really aggressive phase cancellation. I think, especially in Serum, the easiest thing to do is to take a macro and map the fine tune of one oscillator, in this case, oscillator A, all the way negative, and then map the fine tune of oscillator B all the way positive. So that way, if I play some notes, there's no detune right now. Let me turn off this filter as well. Go over that filter in a second. That's just for some interest. Yeah, so if we play some notes now, there isn't any detune, but I can now dial this in however I want. And I think the benefit, or one of the reasons why I really recommend doing this with a macro is, one, you have manual control over the amount of detune that you want. You could say, well, I could just adjust, the detune knob here or the unison. And that's true. And in some sense, like Serum 2, you have these algorithms that give you a little bit more control. But again, you're sort of at the mercy of the synth and the developers that made it, where creating a knob where you know what the result will be usually leads to more control over a sound. And then this waveform macro is just a macro that I created to go from, I think we're going from a sine to a square to a saw wave. So it changes these waveforms in this is just an efficiency thing. That's the only difference. So let's turn our filter back on just so we can kind of hear the whole thing. The only effects on here are a low pass filter, just to get that warm saw wave Reese feel. If I turn it off, it's just a little too gritty. Not terrible, just not really what I'm going for. And then chorus, just to add some stereo width. And that's it. That's the Reese bass sound. One of the most simplified versions, I would say. So we've gone from this to this. So another approach to Reese basses, something known as a neuro Reese or a neuro bass. And I'm going to use phase plant for this, but again, you can do this in any synthesizer. I like to use something like a phase plant because I can do most of the work inside of the synth and not have to have an infinite chain of plugins afterwards. But really, all we're doing here is, let me turn off this curve real quick. We're doing essentially the same thing. In this case, I'm using a dedicated oscillator for the sub. I'll explain why in a second. I'm using a saw wave with, in this case, it's unison, but there's no stereo width to it, so it's just creating the detune. And then I'm just mixing in some noise, some stereo noise to fill the sound up. And if we listen to this, this might be a little gritty, so brace yourself. one of the key components I feel that makes a neuro bass or a neuro Reese what it is, additional phase issues, let's say, on top of the normal phase cancellation of the Reese. So if we turn all of these effects lanes off, we get this. That is essentially what we just did in the other, this unison detune serum patch. Where the neuro part starts to come in is with filters. Usually it's multiple filters, and more specifically, it's typically notch filters. And it's various notch filters moving around at different rates. In this case, I only have these two LFOs here, but you can really dive in on this. And they sort of carve out the mid-range, or even like the low mid-range of the sound. And it creates this phasing, flanging effect that we know to be neuro Reeses. So if we start to turn these off, just to explain this effects rack, what's going on here is I have sounds going to lane 1, which is kind of like the mono signal, if you will. And then this lane 2 is like the side or the stereo signal. It's not a true side channel. It's all the same effects. The only difference here is that I am cutting the low end out of this and then adding a chorus to it for more width. So I'm attempting to get a stereo layer, and then lane 3 is kind of like the master effects layer where I'm then gluing those things back together. So if we listen to this without these notch filters on, and we'll turn this flanger off as well, it's just this. It's just kind of a more gritty version of the saw wave. But once we start putting these filters on and start moving things around, really by subtractive synthesis or subtractive EQ, we start to get that phasing sound. So neuro Reeses are something that really can take up their own video or lecture. That could be something I could just spend an hour talking on, because there's really no one way to just do it and get a neuro Reese. But the basics, I would say, are creating some sort of Reese bass and then using a combination of distortion, notch filtering, distortion, notch filtering in an order that works for that particular sound. It's not always you have to distort and then you do a notch. It might be, in this case, it's distortion, 2 notch filters, a flanger, and then another distortion, and then a saturator, and then some other post-processing stuff. And then there could be a notch at the end of that. It all comes down to what sounds good or what you're going for. And in this case, just for a quick demonstration of a neuro Reese. Yeah, I just wanted to show you that saw waves detuned with some notch filters and distortion and get you into the, onto the target, so to speak. And you just keep tweaking it until you get the sound that you actually want. Something I do want to cover in this patch is why there's a dedicated sub. And so let's take a look at a 4X. Drag this over to the main screen. Now, on this 4X, it's very important. I want you to pay attention to the frequency space. And I'm going to rotate this so it's easier to see. I want you to look down here in this low sub area. So we're really like 60 hertz and below. I'm going to drag the phase plant off of this screen so you can see what's happening, but I will describe what I'm doing as well. So first thing I'm going to do here is just play the Reese bass without the sub. And let's put this on sync. So if you pay attention down here in the low frequencies, almost from 80 hertz and below, you can see there's a lot of jumping. And the reason why that's jumping, it's inconsistent, is because of the phase cancellation that we're creating with the Reese bass. So usually with a long sustained sound, we don't necessarily want the sub low frequencies to be dropping out sporadically. Just to be clear, we're not talking about something like a long machine gun stab kind of bass. We're talking about just a sustained sound like a Reese bass. So if I play one long C note, it should just be consistent low end the whole time. That can be problematic when you're detuning to waveforms and you're trying to create this phase cancellation. So to attempt to remedy that, what I've done is turned this sub oscillator on. And now you can see that the bass really kind of exists around this like low D, D sharp, The reason why it's not here presently is because we're now playing another note where the fundamental exists around 80 hertz, D sharp, an octave up. But you can see that this wave isn't jumping sporadically. So to demonstrate, I can add a bunch of detune to the sub. If I actually turn off the saw wave and the noise, you'll see that the sub is just jumping up and down the whole time now. So see how it's just kind of bouncing like that? That's not terrible in this case, but that could potentially harm your mix down or your kick bass relationship. So just be mindful of those things. You don't always have to separate the sub out. That's something that I see a lot of people say, and I partially disagree with that. Sometimes sounds aren't better when you separate the sub out. Sometimes you need it kind of baked in. And if it's not something that's hurting your mix, then I would say you shouldn't concern yourself with isolating it. But if it's something where you see my sub is jumping sporadically, 10 dB or something like that, I would say, yeah, then you should maybe high pass the initial, the mid body of the bass and then add in a dedicated sub to just be mono and upfront and consistent. So that's why I have a separate sub on this track, and I might have on others. So let's go on to another way. This is, I think, one of my favorite ways to create a Reese, and I would say this is a more modern approach to this. And this is using FM synthesis or phase distortion, phase modulation to create the phase cancellation that we need. And so both can yield cool results. I tend to use phase distortion and phase modulation more simply because the threshold for good sound or a sound that I like is a lot lower, or the tolerance for a sound that I like is a lot lower using FM synthesis. So what I mean is, like, once we get past like 20% in this case, we have a dedicated sub oscillator here. Oscillator A is just a saw wave, and then oscillator B is turned all the way down, and we're going to FM oscillator B into A. There's two voices of unison here. I've discussed this in other videos, but this short envelope on the detune creates, it's like a phase lock stereo width. So we're not actually using the detune, we're just using two voices of unison to get a stereo signal, and then all of the phase cancellations coming from the FM. So if we turn this off, it's just a saw wave. Oh, that's a drum beat. This is the saw wave. Saw wave, some white noise, a little bit of distortion, some low pass filtering, and chorus for more stereo width afterwards. So if we turn oscillator B on and we bring up our FM knob, you'll see that the sound will get lost really quickly. So let's do that. Now we're kind of in the Reese territory. And then it quickly gets away from us. So that's one way to do it. The other way that I like to do it is with phase distortion in the case of Serum 2. Sometimes it's called phase modulation and something else. Similar thing, we're going to use oscillator C. It's the same waveform, so it is a saw wave that is detuned about 84 cents on the fine tuning. I don't think I covered that on oscillator B, but it's the same amount of detune. So we're doing that same thing from the oscillator detune patch that we went over, where we're taking two saw waves, detuning one slightly, but instead of having that be audible, we're turning the level all the way down, and now we're just phase distorting it into oscillator A. So let's hear what happens. So I think that the range for what is tolerable for a sound is a lot larger when it comes to phase distortion versus FM. So like, we don't really lose the sound. And when I say lose the sound, I mean something that's just like harsh on the ears and doesn't sound good, and it wouldn't be something that you would use as like a long-term consistent sound in a tune until we're like really up past like 60%. And even some of this still could be like this. I'm not saying that this is exactly the sound or anything, but I know that, what is it? It's like a Noisia Skrillex tune. Can't think of it off the top of my head. It's the one with Josh Pan. There's tons of tutorials on it, but the essence of that sound is like saw waves phase distorted, and one's like a bunch of octaves up, so it really gives it like that gritty. Let's turn this up 3. Yeah, so I mean, you have options there, but that's not the point of this one. The point of this is just to show you that you can use that carrier modulator relationship to also create respaces. And I would say this is a more modern controllable approach where you're not sort of at the mercy of a detune knob. Just to go over the processing again, we're not doing much here. We're using some diode to distortion just to glue everything back together, so to speak, by saturating it, and then low pass to cut off some of those highs, and some chorus for some width. Now, this next technique is something that I want to go over because it can be very time consuming. It doesn't have to be, but it depends on what you want to get out of this particular patch. I think this is the most modern approach to creating respaces right now, and it's something that I call the false Reese or the pseudo Reese. And it's because if we play this respace, you can hear we're getting that phase cancellation, but if you look at this patch, there is no unison. There's actually no detune. There's only one voice of unison here, so we can just bypass that and get the same exact thing. The only thing we're using for stereo width afterwards is a chorus, which is not causing the phase cancellation. So what are we doing here? Well, the reason why I call this a false Reese is because we are creating the fake effect or the illusion of phase cancellation. And the way we're doing that is with an LFO on a free, not a retriggered or DAW synced, on a free movement rate, which allows it to feel a bit more organic. If we do something like a retrigger, you'll hear it restart on every note that's played, and it kind of just sounds fake, like too fake and digital. It's not terrible there, but just be mindful. Typically, my goal here was to try to make something that was more warm and traditional than like a super digital neuro Reese kind of thing. So in this case, I have the LFO set to free, and it's actually not synced to the BPM at all. It's in Hertz mode, and at this point, it's at 1.7 Hertz. And then we take the note tracking and we map the note tracking to the rate of this. And all that's doing is it's basically saying key tracking. What this is saying is that we are, every time we play a different note, start the position of this knob relevant to that note. So if I turn this off, if I turn this off, the rate will always be 1.7 Hertz. And that's not what a respace is. The phase cancellation rates are different at different pitches. So same deal. If I turn this retrigger on, maybe it'll sound a little bit more fake now. Yeah, it just kind of, it's too static. It's not organic enough. It doesn't sound alive. So with this modulation on, what we're doing is, as I'm playing these different notes on the MIDI, on the piano roll, it's actually changing the rate at which this LFO is occurring, which is more synonymous with the phase cancellation from taking two waves and detuning them, for instance. So you can see that we're jumping around here. And I have this in a positive direction. It's unipolar and positive because I only want it to speed up when a higher note is played, because that's typically how phase cancellation behaves anyways. And then it's important to note that the LFO is mapped to, but it's not limited to these parameters. You can do almost anything, but level or gain and cutoff, if you're using something like a low pass filter, can get you that fake phase cancellation result. And then something that I did for this particular case was pulse width modulation, which is modulating essentially the width of the waveform. And you can hear it's kind of subtle, but it does sort of create like a detune or a pitch instability. So between the three of these, and I'm trying to do these subtly. They're I think the most we're doing here is like 26% on any given modulation. The rest of these are like 6%, maybe 8%, 6%. And then again, our effects aren't doing much here. So this is what I call the false Reese. Let's hear it with like some drums. Maybe that'll make it sound a little bit different. Yeah, so I think that's currently the most modern way to build a Reese bass. I'm sure that this will be outdated in due time with technological advances, new plugins, new effects, all that kind of stuff. But this is also a really cool way to get a very controlled, predictable sound. You're gonna have to put some time in and some investment into designing one that sounds organic. If that's what you're going for, if you want like that warm, organic kind of jungle Reese bass, or you could go the opposite direction and say, I just want like a really hard digital neuro funk driven, tearing Reese bass. But I want to be able to control all the detune. That might be something you want too. Something that you can do. One of the reasons why I would like you might follow up with the question of, well, if I can just detune to saw waves, why should I do it this way? Yeah, I understand you can control it, but why would I want to control it? What you could do is map a macro to the rate of this. And why don't we make it bipolar just to kind of hit the whole spectrum? But you could automate this macro now, and maybe you want the rate to change at which you're doing this over a long period of time too. So maybe it's something like this. So again, this doesn't necessarily have to be something that you're doing in the context of a tune. Maybe you're just sitting down and designing Reese bases, and the false Reese might allow you to slightly adjust parameters, or just in general adjust parameters and record those results and then build up your own sample library. So not every patch needs to be like efficiently designed to sit into a tune project file best as it can. Sometimes you just need to make wild patches that you open up the project and start turning knobs and recording stuff and then bouncing that, and then you're gonna drop that into something down the line when you're inspired. Now the last approach that I want to talk about to making Reese bases, it isn't technically about making Reese bases. It's about a more modern approach, or not even really modern at this point. I mean, it's no secret, it's out there, it's been out there for years, but it's almost like a way to get extra character out of your Reese, and that's by resampling your Reese. Now when I say resampling, I mean taking a Reese, I think I used this version. So we're taking something like this and we're bouncing it. In this case, I'm going post fader because I think I have a clipper. Yeah, I have a clipper on here. So I just want to make sure it doesn't get past a certain loudness. And then we're taking this sample here. Bitwig allows you to have these instrument layers, which is basically like a group. It's almost like a bus, but instead of sending everything to a bus track, you just have the instruments on one track, which allows you to do some parallel stuff. But in this case, all that matters is that I have two samplers with the Reese bass sample in it. So I've already made the Reese bass, but what I'm doing here, if we just mute one, is you'll hear the sample. Now, when we double this, what we're going to do on this other sampler is actually detune it slightly. So we are now taking a sample of waveforms that have been detuned, doubling it, and then detuning the second one again slightly. And you always want to do this slightly because, again, once you get past like maybe even half a semitone, the sound just gets too muddy to use. But you get these really cool phasing effects if you just kind of double it and detune one slightly so that they're not consistent. In this case, I'm doing 0.05 semitones. So I'm doing, significantly less than one semitone. We're really getting into like the fine tune range here. But let's listen to this. With the drum beat too. And listening back to this is something I would say you'd probably want to make a sine, or not a sine wave. Yeah, a sub, dedicated sub to go under this directly. So why don't we just do that quickly? because that won't be hard to do at all. We'll set it to sine wave. It can just start there. All this stuff can stay the same, and this can change. Just adding some attack and some release, so we're not getting clicks and pops. And it was just this MIDI, so let's hear that real quick. And then we'll just drop these down full octaves too to keep that low bass sound. Yeah, so now let's hear that with our resampled Reese. Okay, yeah, so, it's not amazing, but I would say then you would start designing a patch or a chain to address, this thing. So this combination of these two samples with one slightly detuned, and then the sub under it. I could even just add a sub onto the sampler itself. In this case, it wouldn't work because I'm just playing one long C note, so the sub wouldn't actually be moving the same way. But yeah, this would just be a good demonstration of why you might want to use a dedicated sub bass and a resampled technique. So these are the really 6 approaches, 7 if you want to count just like the traditional unison and detune approach to making respaces. Just to leave you on some thoughts, I want to just reference some of the respaces that have kind of shaped my decision making over time, and some of them are ones that are well known and some not so much. I'm not gonna play any in here. Maybe I'll leave a link with the respaces that have linked to the tunes of those respaces. But I mean, it's anything from like the tune "Stay" by Bladerunner, one of the best examples, like just a really warm saw wave respace. And then of course there's like the tearing respaces from like Noisia's Dead Limit, or Noisia and the Upbeats Dead Limit. Mefjus, the Sirens, that's another respace. Any Villain or Blaine neuro respace sound. And then one that, maybe I'll do a whole separate video covering, because I think this gets more into filtering and distortion and stuff. But a respace that has really shaped a lot of my sound design choices, because it's one that I love, is current values approach to making respaces. And it's particularly the one from Into the Matter off of the Deadly Toys album. That's a really good one too. So I'll leave a link to all of these so you can go listen to those and maybe get some ideas and get inspired about making your own respaces. And again, I hope you found this helpful. If you don't know how to make respaces, hopefully you can take this and start your journey into making one of the most iconic sounds. And if you already knew but you weren't aware of some different ways to do this, hopefully you picked up a trick or two. All right, see you.